First of all, I'd like to give my warmest welcome to all the participants at this moment. Most of you I cannot see, but I know that you are there. I don't know who can see me. Maybe you all can. I can just start with talking a little bit first about myself for 1 minute or so. I've been active at the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University for almost 30 years. And after that, I went to Elsevier and to become a senior scientific advisor with Elsevier. But I resigned in 2014. And as from September 2014, I am a visiting professor at the Sapienza University of Rome and also Granada, and I'm a private consultant as well. I'm doing a lot of work jointly with the SciMago research group. I'm sure many of you will have heard about him. So this is all about me. And in my talk, I would like to subdivide the talk into two parts. So the first part will be a more technical part in which I discuss some main topics, approaches, and indicators. So this is more an introduction to the elementary basic ideas of informatics, especially so-called bibliometrics. And it will take about half an hour. And then the second part will be more reflective and theoretical. And there I will discuss the pros and the cons of the use of these indicators in the assessment of research performance, especially the assessment of individuals, institutions, journals, and so on. So I would like to start now with the technical part. And in this part, I would like to discuss very briefly the following topics. First of all, I would like to introduce one of the founding fathers of our field, that is Derek de Solla Price. Then dedicate some words to science mapping, to international scientific collaboration, the science technology interface. Then, of course, the journal impact factor, but also indicator manipulation. I would like to show you some striking examples of that as well. Some of the standard bibliometric indicators, and last but not least, some words about bibliographic or bibliometric databases. And in the second part, that is the more theoretical or reflective part, I would like to discuss in a broad sense the use of indicators for the multidimensional assessment of output and impact of research. I also would like to distinguish 4 domains of intellectual activity in research assessment. I think it's very important that we make that distinction. Then I would introduce the idea of the desktop assessment and funding model. And this is basically a model that starts from very simplistic, not very realistic, but often used assumptions. And I would like to highlight those assumptions and also show what the alternative assumptions are. And then end up with introducing a multi-level model for academic evaluation and policy in general. So this is what I would like to do in the coming, say, 1 hour or so. And my understanding is that after that there is some time for discussions as well and questions. And I will be happy to hear your questions, and then I will try to answer them. Okay, now very quickly about the background of what I'm going to talk about. The most of it is published in the book Applied Evaluative Informatics, which can be purchased via Springer. It's not very expensive. Actually, it's one of the cheaper books in the field, and also from the publisher. You can find it easily on the Springer website. And I also would like to mention very briefly, one of the other activities that I am currently starting up, and that is the foundation of a new scientific journal. Now you can ask, is this really what we need, a new scientific journal? Well, this journal is special in the sense that it is directed towards a wide scholarly and policy audience. So we have specialist journals, among which Scientometrics, Journal of Infometrics, Quantitative Science Studies, Journal of Information Science, and a lot of others. And they are primarily directed to the specialists in the field. But this journal aims to cover a broad scholarly and policy audience, and very much focus more on the theoretical and the reflective aspects of the use of indicators in research performance. And it also wants to be very practical, so it will really wants to discuss issues that are of principal policy relevance. So in a technical journal like Scientometrics, you can find very good, important papers about statistical, technical aspects of indicators, for instance. This journal is not about those technical exercises, but it is much more about what policy makers, for instance, assume about the validity of indicators, or what policy objectives are that give lead to the application of indicators, just to mention a few examples. So I would like to invite you to take a look at this journal. You can see the website is given here. It's scholarlyassessmentreport.org, and it's currently being started up, and we have published now, I think, 5 or 6 or so papers, but we hope to arrive at 20 at least by the end of the year. Okay, now here the main topics, approaches and indicators. Let me start then with dedicating some attention to the founding father of the field, Derek de Solla Price. Probably most of you, if not all of you, have heard about Derek de Solla Price. I personally never met him. He died very young, I think already in 1982 or so, or 1983. But he is really a founding father, and I want to show that to you now. Here is a screen dump of the most important paper that Derek de Solla Price has written. He published it in the journal Science, and the title is Networks of Scientific Papers. And if you are not familiar with this paper, I really would recommend you to take a look at it, because it's really very interesting, and it contains many of the ideas that have been developed later by our colleagues in the field. Now, as a start, here you see the reference list in the same paper by Derek de Solla Price. So you see the articles that are being cited in his article. And you can also see that there are papers published in different years. So most of the articles that de Solla Price cites are published in 1963. The Price paper itself is published in 1965. So most of them are published in 1963 or 62 or 1960, right? So what you can see here is the distribution of the ages of the articles that are being cited in a particular paper, right? Now, this is an interesting data source that Price has used to study scientific development, and I will show you that in the next slide. This slide presents a figure that is actually copied from the Price paper, and you see on the horizontal axis the years, and on the vertical axis you see the the percentage of papers cited in one particular year, and that is 1961. So you can see that there is if we use a logarithmic scale for the percentage of paper, there is almost a linear, a straight line relationship between the two variables, except for recent years compared to 1961, in which you see some deviation. But you see also two humps or bags, so to speak. And the question is, where do they come from? And probably some of you, if not many of you, are already aware of what the cause is. What we see are here the signs of the First and the Second World War, in which apparently there was a lot less scientific production in terms of papers. And therefore, in 1961, we can see that there are relatively few citations to documents that were published during the wars. And this is simply because there were not so many publications during the wars. So we see here in these reference patterns already a very elementary event in human history. And I think it's fascinating to realize that you can do and analyze the data in this manner. And this is typically Derek de Solle Price. He also introduced the term of research front, and that indicates the fact that this straight line that you can see here deviates a little bit in recent years. That is to say that authors have a certain preference to cite recent articles. Price was, of course, also already aware of the fact that the distribution of citations among cited papers was very skewed. You can see that here. You can see that a large percentage of paper is cited only once, and only very few are cited more than, say, 20 times or so. By the way, in this graph, the number of articles that are not cited at all, they are not in the graph, as you can see. So skewness is a very common phenomenon, and it was already discovered from the very beginning. Now, as regards science mapping, Price has also made the first steps in the science mapping, because in this slide, which is also copied from his paper, the S symbolizes a source item and the C a cited item. And he says that if there were exactly 4 links between a source item and a cited item, you would have a very regular pattern of source articles and cited articles. But of course, this is ideal, and in reality, the number of links can be much more or much less than 4, and then you get a more diffuse pattern. But what you see here appearing is a network based on citation relationships. And I really think it was Derek de Solle Price who was the first who made this kind of map, and who understood that one could create maps based on citations. Well, there are at least 3 ways in which citation relations can be examined. There are 3 relationships. The first is the simple citation relationship, that is, article A cites B. Then we have co-citations. That is the case in which you have one article A that cites both article B and article C. So this means B and C are co-cited. And last but not least, you have bibliographic coupling. That is the case in which 2 papers, A and B, have one cited paper in common. There are also more ways of defining relationships, but these are the main ones. Now, this is a typical example. Maybe it is the first map that was created based on citation relationships, and it was actually made by Eugene Garfield, and it is a so-called historiograph, and it it gives an overview of the developments in the history of the discovery of DNA. And you see the citation relationships among the various papers, including the famous Watson and Crick paper from 1961. So this is also a very illuminative way of looking at these citation relationships. This is a much more modern map, was created in 2012. It's also based on co-citation analysis, but it maps the entire corpus of papers indexed in the Science Citation Index. And you see here the different disciplines. And it looks really like a world map. So in yellow, we see the social sciences, and we see mathematics and physics on the other side of the map. It's just an example to illustrate that there is an enormous activity now trying to create sensible maps of scientific development based on citation relationships. Now, as regards scientific collaboration, here is a typical example of the heading of a particular paper. It's a paper published by the Scimago group, and to which I have participated as well. What I would like to emphasize is that here we see the affiliations of the authors, and the authors are affiliated with institutions from distinct countries. So we have authors from Spain and authors from Italy. And so this paper establishes a link between Spain and Italy, right? Now you can imagine that if you analyze these links for the total corpus of scientific literature, that would result in a very interesting map of relationships among countries, right? And this is also a very important branch of scientometrics, informatics, and bibliometrics. That is the study of scientific collaboration and migration. I just want to show you some typical outcomes. Here, for instance, I have a particular country, and here we see the list of the countries that are the main collaborators of the country from which I have started. So there is one country that has a lot of collaborations with France, but also with Hungary, with Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria. The question is, which country is represented here? Now, we do know that collaboration frequencies are very much determined by political, social, cultural, and historical factors. And that is also the case here. I don't know whether there's anyone who can figure out which country is represented, but I'll tell you, it is Romania. And that, hopefully, you get an aha erlebnis now, because Romania has a Roman language, as you probably know. And we see here countries with Roman languages too, France and Italy. And we see neighboring countries, because Hungary and Bulgaria are neighboring countries. So we see that each country has, so to speak, its own profile in terms of the countries with which it collaborates. I have one other example. Here we have a country that collaborates with Argentina and with Chile, but also with Portugal, and also with the USA, but USA appears on many maps, and France as well. I don't know whether you can think of which country is being represented here, but the answer is it's Brazil, because Brazil speaks Portuguese language, and that explains the link with Portugal. And moreover, Chile and Argentina are actually neighboring countries. Last but not least, just as an example, here I have a country that shows strong relationships with Thailand and Singapore, but also with the UK and with Iran, and then with India too. And this country maybe some of you know this, this is Malaysia, because Thailand and Singapore are at least neighboring countries. UK is a former colonizer, and Iran has strong political relationships with Malaysia, to the best of my knowledge. So here again we see how political, historical, and social factors influence bibliometric patterns. Now a few words about the science-technology interface. I look at my watch, I still have 5 to 10 minutes. This is a very important topic. I will introduce it with the following slide. So here we have papers, and at the bottom I show you some patterns. And the first aspect we can analyze are citations from papers to other papers. Well, this is what we have discussed in the previous section about Derek de Solle Prize. But what is also very important is that one can analyze the way in which science papers cite patents. It can give us a clue of the importance of patents as scientific publications. Then, of course, we can also analyze citations between patents, from one patent to another. And that enables us to analyze inventor networks, knowledge flows from inventors, and so on. And last but not least, we can study the citations from, from patents to scientific papers. And that is interesting because that tells us something about the science base of technology and enables us to study author-inventor networks and so on. And especially studies of the science base of technology have become very important in our field. One historical note, there was an American institution, Computer Horizons, that started this type of analysis already in the 1980s. And they published some results in the 1980s, or like this one, also in the 1990s. And this is shown by me simply to show you that this group has done a lot of work already along the lines of research that I mentioned. And here you see, for instance, that many of these citations in patterns to scientific articles, they take place in the field drugs and medicine. Whereas in other fields, such as transportation, there are very few citations in patents to scientific literature. So there are large differences, so it seems, among the degree to which the various technological fields depend upon scientific research. So we can calculate lots of indicators, citations in patents to patents, authors as inventors, co-publications between academia and industry, authors moving from the academia to the industry, funding acknowledgement in papers to industry, multiple appointments, and so on. So this is another important subject of study in our field. This is a typical example. This analyzes, citations given in patents to library science journals. And what we can see is that there are lots of industries that cite library science journals. So this is the manifestation of the technological impact of the field of library science. You see here the names of big tech corporations such as Microsoft and several others as well. And this gives an idea of the titles of the citing patents and the titles of the cited articles. And just one example, a highly cited article in patents is the article that introduces the co-citation analysis, which was published by Henry Small, as some or many or maybe all of you will know. Now the impact factor, I have to speed up a little bit. I must talk a little bit about the impact factor. You know, of course, the definition. Oh, sorry. It's the citations in a particular year to articles published in the 2 preceding years, divided by the number of so-called citable items published in those 2 preceding years. Right? You probably are aware of this definition. But there is a problem with it, and that relates to the definition of the so-called citable items. So impact factor, that's citations divided by number of citable documents. But you have several types of documents. So we have citable documents and documents that are defined as non-citable, like letters, editorials, discussion papers, and so on. Now, in the calculation of the impact factors, the Institute for Scientific Information, or Clarivate, they operated as follows. Here I see one paper, that's the black symbol here, that is cited a number of times. Here another paper, cited even more. Here a third paper, not cited so much. But now I have also these so-called non-citable items. And the point is, they can be cited too. So here I have, for instance, 3 articles. These are, for instance, letters in the journal The Lancet, or discussion papers in a physics journal. And what happens in the calculation of the indicator? The non-citable items are not counted in the denominator, right? But the citations to those items are counted in the numerator. That means that these citations, they are more or less for free. I hope you understand the point. And this is a source of inaccuracy in impact factors. Not all journals are, of course, affected, but some journals can be affected substantially. Now I have to talk about manipulation. This is also a very important point. I want to show you an example of a journal editor who artificially succeeds in raising the impact factor of his journal. Of course, I can't speak about motives. I don't know the motives of this person, but I can show the consequences. Now, this is the graph that this editor published in his own journal. And he said, look at the impact factor. It has increased over the years, and this shows the success of my policy as an editor of this journal. And you can see actually there is a substantial increase. But now then what? Analyzing it, it seems that there are quite a few free citations involved. That's indicated by the blue squares, as you can see. But that's not all. There are also so-called editorial self-citations. Because what did this editor do? He published editorials. They are non-citable itself. But in his editorials, he cited many of the papers in his own journal. So what you can see, if you correct for these two, say, not normal citations, then you see there is no increase in the impact factor at all. And nowadays, Clarivate is much more aware of these practices, and actually they are monitoring it. And journals for which there are indications that they are manipulating impact factors, they will simply be removed from the index. Now I have to move on. I just wanted to mention one particular indicator, and that is the so-called Hirsch index. Probably you're all familiar with it, but I just wanted to show you one important limitation of this indicator. Now first the definition. Here I have a list of papers and I numbered them from 1 to 8 or 9 or so. And I have here indicated the number of citations. So we have paper number 1 is cited 30 times, paper number 2 10 times, and so on. Now, what is the Hirsch index of this author? That's 5, because there are 5 papers that receive 5 or more citations, right? So far, so good. Now here I have a second author who has the same, say, first 5 numbers of citations, but then he has a long list of papers that are cited a little bit less. They are cited 4 times. What is the Hirsch index of this particular author? It's also 5, because again, there are just 5. There are 5 papers that have 5 or more citations. But now I have an author that has 2 very highly cited papers. One cited 100 and the second cited 70 times. Now, what is the Hirsch index of this author? It's again 5. So all these 3 profiles, so to speak, they give rise to the same value of the Hirsch index. And this is, of course, a limitation of this index. So a pro issue of the index is that it combines both quantity and quality, in a sense, because it tends to be insensitive to highly cited outliers and to poorly cited papers. And this is a good point, perhaps, of the indicator. But its value is very much biased in favor of senior researchers, and the impact of the most cited works hardly affect their value, and the indicator does not correct for differences between subject fields. So it has its pros, but it also has its cons. And I think that is true for all indicators. I don't have the time to make a full list, but in my book I give an overview of the important pros and cons of the various indicators. Last but not least, I don't have much time, so I have to skip a lot of work, but I just wanted to mention one particular outcome as regards databases, sorry, and that relates to Google Scholar. Now, what I first would like to defend, but this is a personal opinion and not a result of any research, is that I think it is a very powerful tool to search relevant literature, and also it's good to track one's own citation impact. But now, comparing it with Scopus, we found that it is even more up-to-date than Scopus. It has a much broader coverage. Actually, the citation frequencies are 1 to 4 times higher in some fields than they are in Scopus. Also, the numbers in Google Scholar and those in Scopus, they correlate very strongly. But there are data quality issues, and the online metrics are poor. And of course, use and evaluation requires that the researchers themselves create a so-called Google Scholar profile. Without a profile, it's undoable to use Google Scholar data to get an impression of the performance of an individual. So again, here we have a mixed result. In some respect, Google Scholar, in my personal view, is superior to the Web of Science and Scopus, but in other respects it is not. So there's no way in which we can simply rank the databases and say this is the best or this is the best. That's not the case. I think that in some fields, especially those fields in which communication takes place mainly via books or conference proceedings, in those fields, Google Scholar is more appropriate, more useful than any of the other citation indexes. Okay, well, I'm a little bit over time, but if you agree, I would like to start now with a more theoretical and a more reflective discussion of the use of indicators in research assessment. So I hope that now you have at least an overview of what bibliometrics or infometrics in principle can do. And I hope I have been able to show you some interesting examples. But now I want to really talk about the use in research assessment. Now, let me first of all underline that research output and impact and research performance are multidimensional concepts. Here I give an overview in terms of the types of output and the types of impact that papers can generate. So I distinguish between publication and non-publication types of output, and between scientific scholarly impact, educational, economic, technological, and social or cultural. And as you can see, each aspect has its own indicators. And in some fields, some indicators can be good and others less good. For instance, in fields in which books are dominant communication carriers, the analysis based on journals gives only a very partial picture of the performance of a group or a researcher. That was just a source of water, right? Now, you can distinguish at least 12 indicator families. And we have, of course, the publication and citation-based indicators. They are, of course, important, also the journal metrics. But we also have patent-based, usage-based, altmetrics, webometrics, research data-based, econometric, reputation-based, network-based, infrastructure-based indicators. So there is a lot more in the science and technology indicators universe than the simple publication and citation count. Now, there are 4 domains of intellectual activity that we should distinguish. First of all, we have the domain of policy. That is the domain in which a policy problem or issue or objective is defined. Then we have the level of the evaluation. And evaluation means that an evaluative framework has to be specified. Because if you don't have an evaluative framework, if you don't have criteria, you can't evaluate. Then we have the level of analytics. And that is the level at which we analyze empirical data. And last but not least, we have, of course, the domain of the data collection, in which relevant data are being collected. Now, infometrics or scientometrics or bibliometrics, they relate to analytics and data collection, but not to policy and not to evaluation. And this is the position that I defend in the book that I showed in the very beginning. So in a sense, infometrics or bibliometrics does not itself evaluate, but it can provide tools to evaluate, but these tools can be used only properly if there is a set of evaluation criteria. But I believe, and this is the position that I defend in the book, that from what is cannot be inferred what ought to be. So evaluation criteria and policy objectives are not informatically provable or demonstrable values. And I also believe and defend the position that infometricians should maintain a neutral position towards these values and assign a hypothetical status to them. And in research assessment processes, they should be much more attention to the development of evaluative frameworks. I will talk a little bit about that later, but I just want to make sure that you understand my point. So again, it is absolutely essential in the use of indicators that we have criteria, that we have a notion of what is good research, what is less good research, what are valid or desirable political objectives and what are not. My point is that bibliometrics or infometrics cannot decide upon what is desirable and what is not, or what is valuable or what is not. This is a domain that cannot be decided upon merely on the basis of bibliometrics or infometrics. It's also important that we realize that the use of indicators, the choice very much depends upon the way in which they are used and the context in which they are used. And here I mention 4 aspects. First of all, what is the unit of assessment? A country or an institution, a network, an individual? Which dimension should be assessed? Is it scientific scholarly impact, social benefit, but multidisciplinarity, participation in networks? What are the purpose and the objectives of the assessment? Is it to allocate funding or improve performance, or to stimulate regional engagement, or to create or decide upon budget cuts? And of course also very much upon, say, systemic or general characteristics of the units. That's also very important. Let me give you an example on that as well. Suppose that we have a country in which there is a feeling, a sentiment, if you will, among policymakers, but also among researchers themselves, that the researchers in the country, they constitute more or less a closed group that has not much interaction with colleagues outside the country. Suppose that that is the case. If you want to assess that and to discuss the need to change that and to promote a policy in which researchers are more open towards colleagues outside the country, if you want all that, then you can use probably also journal impact factors, because they give you, I will discuss it later, at least some glance upon the international orientation of these journals. But suppose that you have a research university that has a vacancy and you have applications from a number of researchers, then you can expect that those who apply, they have a certain research experience. If not, they wouldn't apply. And then it is nonsense, I believe, to use journal impact factors to decide which candidate should be selected. So this is just an example how the overall general or systemic characteristics are also important. Now I come to the desktop assessment and funding model. This term was introduced by 2 colleagues in the field, Diana Hicks and one of our other colleagues. I don't remember the name now, but in any case, Diana Hicks was one of them. And I just want to explain to you what the desktop model means, and also at the same time give some critical comments on the assumptions of the desktop model. So here we go. The first assumption is that you should use only widely available simple indicators, especially publication counts, journal impact factors, and age indices. We know these are also the ones that are provided by the big index creators, Clarivate, Elsevier, and Google Scholar. We know that. But an alternative approach is, of course, that you create tailor-made indicators that are appropriate for the application context. Secondly, in the desktop model, it is assumed that the indicators, they measure what they're supposed to measure, and no confirmation from other sources is needed. What you often hear from managers, from universities, for instance, is the following reasoning. They say, I simplify things a little bit, but it is just that I want to explain, say, the broad line of their argument. They say, well, whether or not these simple indicators are valid or not, I'm not very much interested in it. But these indicators enable me to create, say, a market value and to enhance my visibility among students and researchers. So here we have an example of market-dominated thinking. The validity doesn't matter. It is the impression that it takes, of that it generates among the public, that makes me use it. And this is, of course, a rather dangerous and, well, definitely not the best way to use these indicators. Instead, you could say that indicators should be combined with other expert qualitative knowledge, and that they measure preconditions to performance at best and not performance itself. Then the aspects measured by the indicators constitute appropriate evaluation criteria. This happens as often. I mean, there are certain evidences that some managers, they use journal impact factors simply because they have nothing else. There's no alternative, or they don't have an alternative available. So they assume that they are useful in the same way as they could be useful to assess journals rather than individuals. And I think that it is very important, as I said in the earlier slides, that it is important to have an independent evaluative framework. Then there is always this assumption: the higher the score, the better the performance. But that is too simplistic. And one way, or one example of an alternative approach, is that you use indicators, perhaps, to use and define minimum standards rather than identifying the top of a ranking. For instance, just as an example, you could say, instead of saying, well, I'm evaluating on the basis of the impact factor of the journals in which is being published, and I want to reward the situation in which research is published in high impact journals. What you could also say is, it's reasonable to have a policy in which you would require researchers to publish maybe 1 out of 5 papers in an international journal. So here we use the indicators to define a minimum rather than the top of the ranking. Then there's also always this assumption that the best performer receives the largest support. That's what many people in the desktop model actually believe. But that is, of course, very questionable. and I cannot discuss the details, but you could also imagine, for instance, a funding scheme or a funding formula that does not base itself on, say, the total number of publications or the total impact, but it could focus on the number of emerging research groups in a particular institution. So then it's not necessarily the best performer that obtains more funds, but it would be the institution that stimulates emerging research that deserves a relatively large share of funding. It's just an example to show that these simplistic assumptions in a desktop model, they can be challenged, and there are alternative ways in which one can use the indicators. Now, the main thesis of the book is basically this. First of all, calculating indicators of an individual and claiming that they measure the performance of an individual suggests a false precision. Secondly, university rankings are influenced by political premises and objectives. Thirdly, altmetrics, that is basically metrics based on, for instance, Twitter or other social media, should not be used to help evaluative academics for anything important, unless perhaps as complementary measures. And fourth, the informametric evidence or not, whether journal impact factors are good indicators of the quality of the peer review system and international orientation, is questionable. I think it's very thin informametric evidence for this claim. So these are the four points of view that I try to defend in the book. And I just would like to give you a clue or a main consideration for each of them. But I have to be fast because we don't have that much time anymore. As regards the evaluation of individuals, what does this false precision mean? Well, my main point is that research is teamwork, and multiple co-authorship is a rule rather than an exception, especially in natural and life sciences, but not only there. So the crucial issue is, how should one relate the publication output or the citation impact of a team to the performance of an individual working in this team? That is the problem. I hope you understand my point. And then my point is that this issue cannot merely be solved in an informametric way. This means that I'm also not very positive about attempts to try to solve this issue informatrically by using fractional countings or so. Sophisticated as they may be, I don't think that this is the right way in which one should deal with this fundamental issue of assessing an individual on the basis of teamwork. And I think, and I defend the position, that the only way out is to introduce qualitative expert knowledge about this individual. Informametric indicators alone will never be sufficient to come up with valid, appropriate assessments of individuals. This is my position. As regards the university rankings, again, there's not very much time, but I wanted to underline again that the geographical coverage and rating methods, selection of indicators, and indicator normalizations they influence the ranking positions and are also affected by political and social factors. And there are many examples of that. Maybe in the discussion I can show you some examples. I don't want to give the details now. I also believe that these ranking systems are still one-dimensional in the sense that they show seemingly unrelated indicator values in parallel. So they do not show the relationship between a set of indicators. And while they could in principle, but they don't do that. And there's much more insight needed into the effects of methodological differences between the various systems and their effects. I can't give the details at this very moment. I just want to give you a clue about this last topic that I would like to discuss, and that is this multi-level model for the use of metrics in academic evaluation and policy. And there is one basic assumption that I have. It is essentially a kind of political assumption, and it is that we need autonomous universities. And I will explain later what I mean with this. Now, to explain the model, first of all, I would like to distinguish between three types of activities. That links a little bit back to the four domains that I distinguished in an earlier slide. So we have the data, the level of data activity. Then we have the elaboration of the data. And we have the policy issue. That's one thing that I want to distinguish. And I want to distinguish two levels of aggregation. And I indicate them as level of institution or department and national. Now, let me first say that regardless of the level of aggregation, it is important, if you want to use indicators, that there is a system that contains data and indicators of groups and individuals, that is validated, that is accurate, and so on. And both levels, both the institutions and a national organization can contribute. Well, so far so good. But here it comes now. There is one line that departs from a national institution, and it can statistically aggregate data and individuals per institution and use these aggregate statistics to distribute funds among institutions, or it can be used to monitor the internal evaluation and funding processes within institutions. I will explain this later further. So this is the first line. The second line, which is located within an institution, should combine indicators with expert knowledge and can then be used to do two basic activities. It can be used to, now I can't. It can be used to assess individuals and groups, of course, once the indicators are combined with expert knowledge. And they can be used in other ways. But what is important is that assessment of individuals and groups cannot directly take place by a national institution that is at a large distance from the group of individuals and groups that are being assessed. So there are national systems in some countries in which national organizations do assess or make statements about the performance of individuals and groups. And what I'm defending in my book is that it is an inappropriate way of using the indicators. So at the national level, you can statistically aggregate and perhaps use them in formula to distribute funds among institutions, but you should not look into the kitchen, so to speak, within an institution, because the indicators do not give a sufficiently complete picture of what is happening within those institutions. And again, combining indicators with expert knowledge is absolutely essential. What national institutions can do is also monitor in some way the way in which institutions shape their own funding and assessment processes. But that is more marginally testing the processes within an institution rather than that it is an assessment of the individuals or the groups within the institution. I think it is essential that we make a distinction between these two aspects. And again, I'm defending this position in discussions with representatives from other countries. I may maybe mention one particular example, and that is the example of Italy. In Italy, there is, sorry, there has been, and there still is, a system in which there is a direct link, so to speak, between a national organization on the one hand and the assessment of individuals. And also in that discussion, I defend the position that that is an inappropriate use. But of course, let me draw some conclusions. The supra-institutional entity, I indicated this as a national entity in the earlier slide. It acknowledges that it is the primary responsibility of the institutions themselves to conduct quality control. Now here we see the direct reflection of this basic assumption of the autonomy of academic institutions. So this is clearly a conclusion that is not politically neutral. It is based upon the assumption of autonomy. This supranational entity could stimulate institutions to profile themselves on the basis on how they define and implement a notion as complex as academic research quality. So I am very reluctant to promote a situation in which there is one single organization that decides uniformly about the criteria that have to be applied by a large number of independent autonomous institutions. I don't think that that is an appropriate way to organize the research system. It would be much better to give institutions the freedom to define their own ways of grasping something like research quality or research performance. There are many ways in which it can be filled in, and I would not be in favor of the situation in which one single organization decides for all institutions how these notions should be filled in. I'm very much, I have I'm against it, and I defend against this. Of course, a necessary condition is that institutions should make next steps in the organization of their internal quality control and funding procedures. It is my proposal is a coin, and the coin has two sides. On the one hand, it wants to give more freedom to institutions, but on the other hand, it demands that institutions develop a serious, well-organized system of quality control and funding. And this is not realized in all institutions. And this is also why this marginally testing of processes becomes important, because it is, I think, the whole system, as I describe it, works only if there is at least some agency that marginally tests whether the processes of assessment and evaluation in an institution are sound and serious or not. I'm also aware of institutions in which these processes are not serious. And if there are many of these institutions in the country, then, or maybe even if there's only one, then the system doesn't work anymore. And last but not least, I think informatricians should communicate better with potential users about the informatic component of assessment processes and its evaluative and political assumptions. And this is one of the reasons why I decided to start with a few colleagues this new journal, Scholarly Assessment Reports. Now, last but not least, I think I have one more minute. The real challenges, in my view, in the assessment of research performance using indicators are the following. The first is how to combine development and application of indicators with the critical examinations of their effects. Because it is, of course, unthinkable that you can implement a system without analyzing, monitoring the effects that it has upon the subjects that are that undergo that system. And maybe there has not been enough attention to this phenomenon of research into the effects of certain processes and use of certain indicators. What is also important is that, especially for informatricians and bibliometricians, is to maintain a methodological independence from the values and the political objectives, because, as I explained, they cannot be established or proven informatically. And then how to involve a wider scientific scholarly community in informatic research and development. And finally, how to combine professional informatic criteria with the broader personal, evaluative, and political values and beliefs. So these are issues about which we have to think a little bit further and to see whether we can make progress in the future. This ends my lecture, and I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm available for questions and discussion, at least until in the next 20-25 minutes or half an hour or so.
Yeah.
Maybe if you want, we can have a few minutes of a break, perhaps.
Yeah, I think we can go directly with the questions. There are a few questions here. And firstly, I would like to thank Prof. Hank for this great informative lecture with real experience, mainly in the assessment field and the assessment of the metrics and how to use in the organization, the funding agencies. We have now 80 participants in this lecture. So I have few questions here. So I need to, it's just briefly, like the desktop assessment model. It depends on the organization to choose which of the, I mean, what's the criteria for choosing this assessment model, and what's the source? You have built it, or there's an organization who proposed this desktop assessment model? This is the first question.
Well, it is a delicate matter. Let me say this in advance. It's very complex problem, huh?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you want to give autonomy and freedom to universities, but on the other hand, you want them to play against following certain rules. So there is, I mean, it's a coin and it has two sides, and both sides are there. I think, first of all, that there needs to be at a national level, a discussion about the principles of how to assess and how to fund research or academic institutions in general. So this discussion is very important. And then I believe there will be some kind of a consensus, and it's difficult to impose that a priori, and I can't do that. But I can imagine the following situation, just to give you some examples. Now we have the problem in which you have different type of academic institutions. You have the genuine research universities, but you also have teaching universities. You also have universities that are very much regionally oriented. You have universities that focus on particular disciplines, and for instance, social sciences and humanities. So there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. But what you would like to see is that each university in each field makes a serious attempt to define and discuss and motivate their own assessment criteria. I think that would be the start. And then I can imagine that from those criteria, then you can derive the indicators that are needed. And also you can make a list of the indicators that are not useful at all. We know that for a university focusing on social sciences and humanities, it makes no sense to use a database that is dominated by the natural and life sciences. We all know that. So this is one thing. But of course, how do you test marginally whether a process, an assessment process, is defensible or say appropriate, valid or not? Now this is a very sensitive, difficult issue. One way of answering it is by saying, I don't know, I want to leave it open how that precisely will take place. But I can imagine that well, let me give you some examples. If there is evidence that in a particular university, say research professors, or academic professors, I should say academic professors, they have no research activity at all, then that may have implications for the way in which their tasks are being defined, and may give rise to the introduction of, say, different types of academic professors, such as research professors and more teaching professors. I think there is a tendency already going on, at least in the Netherlands, but I think in other countries as well, in which these matters are now being discussed. So suppose that that there is evidence that some professors are not active at all, but they merely use the papers and the activities of colleagues, say the more junior colleagues, in order to have at least some output. If there's evidence, then there should be that evidence should become get into the open, and then there should be some agency. There should be some say some potential, at least say repercussion. That should have consequences, because it's not in agreement with how a research assessment, a policy within the institution should take place. But I cannot, I hope you understand my point. I just want to give an example, but I would like to keep it open. I think it is a challenge for, say, the good or the best researchers in a country to think about the way in which this marginally testing of autonomous universities can take place.
Yes, thank you, Prof.
Well,
thank you for the answer. Okay, I have another question. That what's the new there's a new concept which is museometrics and media metrics introduced by Thierry Lafougue. Is there any clarification about these two new metrics, museometrics and media metrics?
Usage metrics and media metrics. Yes.
Yeah.
Let me see. Well, first of all, say from the point of view of the individual researcher who wants to know more about the impact or the response of his own work, I think these usage data and also the media metrics can be very useful, and especially usage. But it's technically very difficult to calculate reliable statistics on usage, because the data is simply not available. Well, this is a rather technical discussion, but you depend upon the openness of publishers, whether they are willing to give away the usage data of the papers of their journals if you want to create an indicator system. Well, and that openness, to the best of my knowledge, has not yet been realized. So it is, in my view, potentially usage data are certainly of interest, because they can be very useful if citation counts are less valid. For instance, in fields in which the communication is not very well covered. So it is, as a complementary measure, I think it's important, but technically speaking, it's very difficult to create reliable usage counts. Another problem is, as you can imagine, I mean, you have many versions of the same paper, and in many sites you can have them in different repositories. They can be at the publisher website, they can be at the personal website of an author. So how do you combine all those data, for instance? Well, that's already technically very difficult. And also, that's a general point, you know, a citation in a publication published in the open literature, a citation, that's a public act, right? Because everyone sees the citation. But usage, downloading, that's not a public act. It is something that takes place mostly within a more private, or at least maybe in an institutional atmosphere. So there is less control on who is downloading and what happens with the downloading and so on. that makes it very difficult. As regards the media metrics, well, there is let me put it this way. There is a view in my field that basically goes like this. It accepts the use of indicators as we have developed it in the case of citations, with all the experiences and all the methods, but what they propose is to replace citations with media metrics. Well, I'm very much against that view. I don't think that media metrics have the same potential power or the same validity as the citation metrics have. Both have their limitations. I'm not saying that one is perfect and the other is not, on the contrary. But media metrics, they of course, they very much depend upon the subject, and they depend very much on the activities of the authors themselves. If you are active on Twitter, and if you Twitter a lot, and if you make your work via Twitter knowledgeable, and so on, then you will be able to gain a certain visibility in Twitter. But if you don't do that, then your visibility may be much lower. So what you actually measure is not only, say, the degree of attention of a wider audience, but also the extent to which the work has actually been exposed to that audience. So it's very complex. I would say, as a complementary measure, especially for self-assessment, I think these methods can be very useful. But collecting them, putting them together and making some kind of a statistical system and using them in the same way as we have used citations, no, I think I'm very much against that. I see many problems arising if you would like to do that.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I have another question. Like you have talked about the false position. Okay, so do you have any problem or obstacles being indexed for the Italian written papers, like for the researcher writing in Italian language or Malaysian language or Arabic language, because all those indexes they index in English language only. So do you think that it's fair to consider, or it's a false positions for those researchers?
Yes, well, the factor language is of course extremely important. I have not talked much about it today. I'm working actually on it. There are several papers in my new journal about this issue, and there are also there's one or two forthcoming. And I think there's much more interest nowadays, say since 1 or 2 years, in this issue, in the language issue, than there was, say, 5 to 10 years ago. 5 to 10 years ago, there was a sentiment among a broad community that English is the lingua franca, so to speak, of science and scholarship. But now it becomes more and more clear that this is not the case. I mean, it has never been the case, but now there is more attention to it, and there's more interest in it, and there are more analyses that are showing it actually, that the factor language is very important, and that for instance, if you talk about citation indicators, that the probability of being cited, or at least cited in terms of a registered citation in one of the indexes, that very much depends upon language. And the relationship between impact, citation impact, and national orientation is very complex, is not simply linear, as we have found. So get back to your question, I would like to say two things. It's very complex. That's clear. Huh? Maybe I can express a more personal view. I think that it would be important that we take much more into account the factor language. But in this discussion, I would also defend the position that it is inappropriate, at least that's what I defend, inappropriate to take the position that language is unimportant and that you can, as a researcher, just publish in your own language and that's enough, so to speak. I really think that it is worthwhile to try to bring your work to the attention of a large audience. And then the question becomes, what is a good strategy to do that? And one of the strategies could be, for instance, that you publish also occasionally, at least, in a non-native language, and especially if you are not not from the Anglo-Saxon domain, to publish in English. I personally don't see a problem even in terms of, say, a minimum criterion to propose that researchers, even if they publish in Spanish, that they occasionally make, in some kind of a review perhaps, or otherwise, occasionally try to make their work readable for a much wider audience and publish in English. But I'm not saying that it should become dominant. That's not the point. There are many researchers, especially in social sciences and humanities, who underline the importance of publishing in your own language, in your mother language. I do not deny that, but I just want to say that I think it is also reasonable to propose to bring your work to a wide audience by occasionally addressing papers to this wider audience. But this is my personal view. I don't know how you think about it, but this is.
Yeah, I do agree with you. But the problem is that many universities depends on those ranking, on those metrics, like on the H-index and for the times and other like on webometrics. So I think it's unfair, or many researchers think it's unfair to evaluate based on only those metrics. Yeah. Maybe if there's any other metrics taking into consideration the language factor. So I don't know what's happening in Italy or other countries, but in general, I consider it unfair for the researcher to be evaluated by only those metrics, popular metrics.
Yeah, well, this I agree, and I think that, by the way, the influence of these international rankings is too large. It's becoming too large. So we, sorry. So it's important, and I try to do that also inside my own journal. We should criticize these rankings. They should not become, say, the ultimate norm, so to speak, for assessment of institutions. I don't think that that's a good development. And I agree it's unfair to compare directly, for instance, universities in non-Anglo-Saxon countries with those in Anglo-Saxon countries. At least if you use an index that's very much Anglo-Saxon biased, such as the Science Citation Index. I agree, that's unfair.
Yeah.
And because you cannot, if I may add, it's interesting. I'm doing some work now with the database Scopus, but I've done some work with the Science Citation Index as well. And it's interesting is if you analyze journals in terms of their national orientation, by simply, for instance, looking at the journals in which there's one country that publishes, I don't know, 60, 70 or 80% or so of papers. And if you do that across countries, then you can see that the non-Anglo-Saxon countries, they have a certain relatively high percentage of journals in which they are, contribute the largest number of papers. But the same is true for the US. So in a sense, the Web of Science, so to speak, is at least in as far as the social sciences and humanities are concerned, is very much biased towards the US. And this is not strange, because when the Social Science Citation Index, and especially the Arts and Humanities Citation Index, when they were created by Eugene Garfield, my understanding is that Garfield looked for a product that he could sell in the US. It's as simple as that, and that is what actually happened. So there is an enormous, relatively large number of US journals in that index. And
Yes.
so, but this is not very well known. So we hope by distributing this type of information, that people understand that there are serious biases that are caused by the language factor.
Yes, true. Okay, there's one more question from Dr. Akram. He said that he's asking, many of the assessments depends on the quantity, but there is no improvement in the quality. So do you think the proposed assessments will maintain the quality as well?
Well, then the question is, if we talk about quality, the question then is, of course, what kind of quality, which aspects are involved, and how can we reasonably assess them? I'm not sure what the person who asked the question is referring at. There is, of course, a lot of discussion about the role of peer review. Peer review could be an instrument that can provide qualitative information in an assessment. And my view is that I agree with that. So the issue is, how can you combine the metrics that we have available with the peer review in a sensible way, with the result that not only quantitative but also qualitative insights are playing a role in the assessment. And there are now experiments have been done, and there are different ways of doing. I mean, it's very complex. I mean, if a manager, say a dean of a faculty, has to promote a few people, and he doesn't know how to do it, and then he takes just the impact factors of the journals, and he says, well, the ones who have the highest impact factor, they are being promoted. Well, this is, of course, an assessment that nobody in our field would support. So, on the other hand, you can say that these metrics can be used also to make the peer review a little bit more honest, a little bit less biased, and it can stimulate peers to make their judgment more explicit. That is the position that we have always defended during the past 30 years or so. And we have had several experiments in the Netherlands with assessment committees, had peer review groups that had to assess research departments and individuals, and they used the indicators as an additional, sorry, as an additional tool, and they claimed that these indicators were very useful, and there was definitely not a full correlation, not at all, between indicators and peer judgment. But it can help to formalize and to sharpen the discussions among peers about the performance of institutions. And so as regards to the person who asked the question, I think that the challenge will actually be to devise methods in which the input of qualitative knowledge is ensured. And this is why I'm so much against this Italian system in which a bureaucratic organization at the level of at the national level, a bureaucratic organization merely on the basis of indicators makes far-going decisions about individuals in the institutions. That is, of course, inappropriate way of doing.
Yeah, there's one digital platform named Publons, acquired by, I think, Web of Science. So do you mean that the metrics from Publons we can consider it as a qualitative? You mean there's a quantitative and there's a qualitative? So the metrics from the Publons we can consider it for.
Oh, yeah, that's the Publons one that records the peer review.
The peer review.
Yeah. Oh, that is an additional. That if I would evaluate an individual, I certainly would look at that as well. I think that's I didn't mention it, and it's good that you or the person who addressed this question, it's very useful that he's mentioning this. I didn't give much attention to it, but I think that's a very good development, because it enables you to demonstrate that you are doing certain activities that are a regular part of your job, so to speak, but you have a more, say, formalized proof of it. That can only be helpful. And I do believe that this information can be considered as well. And I think they are being considered. And the more people are using or record their work in Publons, the more reliable or the more complete it will be. So yes, I'm very much in favor of that. That's one way of doing it. But if I may, it's very important. I can say from two sides. It's important that there is, say, some validated qualitative knowledge about the background of the group or the individual or the department that have to be evaluated. And that information, that knowledge is relevant or can be very relevant, but it's not in the metrics. So there must be, you must design a process that ensures the input of this type of information. If not, then I think you have a problem. Also, you can also consider it from the other side. It is very well known that there are bibliometric outcomes that are artifacts, and you need, in the process, there must be a way in which it is recognized that particular indicators are invalid or do not reflect well a particular performance whatsoever. Let me give one example, if I may. I once did a study on 6 research groups, and we collected all the papers that were published by members of those groups, and then we calculated indicators and so on. And then there was one group that had an extremely high citation per publication ratio, something like that, or a normalized one, doesn't matter. Extremely high. Now, from a distance, you would say, oh, this is probably then the best group. But then it appeared that this group had a good performance, beyond any doubt. But it was, it participated in a DNA research project on the DNA structure of a particular bacteria, I think it was. There were 100 groups involved in that work. It was published in Nature. It was cited 500 times. And this group was one of the 100. So the score of the group reflected the total impact of a network of 100 or so people. Well, then there must be someone, or there must be a moment at which somebody can bring in the knowledge and say, well, this is ridiculous to assign this to a group because it is a multinational paper published by 100 institutions. You cannot, you simply cannot calculate indicators in this way and interpret those indicators in this way. You understand? That is also very important. So we need knowledge about the background of the groups that are being evaluated. What are they doing? What are the circumstances? What about their funding? Maybe about personal tensions or personal problems. That can also be irrelevant. Now, one thing. And the second thing, on the artifacts, the nasty things that can happen with indicators. And I think that my colleagues and myself, we have seen many cases in which the indicators obviously did not reflect at all what the users believed that they reflected. So there must be a way in which there should be someone or who can say at that moment, no, wait a minute, this is not the right way to use these indicators, or this indicator does not reflect what you seem to believe that it does.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So one more, or the last question about the scholarly assessment reports. .org. So this is, I think, your scientific journal. So does it accept other like in Malaysian language or Arabic language? The second question is it open access journal? Is it indexed by Scopus? How much the publication fees? Can you just elaborate more about this journal?
Well, good question. It is an open access journal. And it is also subsidized. At least the first 20 papers or so in a year are subsidized. And the costs are around $500.
Yeah, is it indexed in Scopus or not yet indexed?
It's not yet. That's the problem. It's not yet indexed. So we try to have it indexed, of course, as soon as possible in the Scopus and the Web of Science, but now it isn't, and I hope that it will be possible to have it indexed at least in the emerging sources index next year in Clarivate and also in Scopus. But I cannot guarantee, I cannot promise this. They have their own criteria. And the point is also, it's a little bit unfair, but I understand. I understand the question. But it is, of course, for a journal that we are trying to publish, I'm not sure that citations are the best measure for impact. Maybe usage and the extent to which we really succeed in reaching out to a wide audience, that would be an important criterion, I would say. Much more than whether or not it is cited by, say, the experts in the field, because those are the ones who are being indexed in that index. You understand?
Yeah,
so
sure.
it's a very difficult situation. But we do our best. I mean, if you can't beat them, join them. The publisher actually would like to see us to get it indexed in Scopus and Web of Science. So this is what we will try to do. As regards the publication language, it's a good question. I have well, my feeling is that the publication language should be English, but we accept at least abstracts or summaries, even extended summaries, in another language. You understand? So I think that if you really want to reach out to this wide audience, you have no choice other than publishing in I think in one single language, and in this case it will be English. What we can do is maybe see whether we can provide some help in translating it.